Thank you, Athena. Um, Global masculinity is in crisis. In Afghanistan, we've seen a well-equipped army of westernized, woman-respecting men crumble and flee in the face of an indigenous, tradition-bound, woman-oppressing Männerbund of illiterate peasants, even as we did a few years earlier in Iraq. In the West, a record number of teenage girls are requesting gender reassignment as boys, and in our zeal to re-educate boys away from the protocols of toxic masculinity, we encourage them to become more sensitive and feminine, as risk-averse parents keep them under ever tighter surveillance and passive dependency. Male students form an ever-shrinking proportion of university enrollments, down to about 40% in the US currently. Drug addiction and suicide rates among young males are at an all-time high. Justified feminist resistance to male sexual aggression has put the concept of masculinity itself on the defensive throughout Western societies. Although the causes were different, late 5th century Athens experienced a similar crisis of masculinity. Men felt helpless to defend their families in the face of a devastating plague and the ensuing collapse of traditional values under challenge by new sophistries. On an annual basis, Athenians endured the humiliation of retreating inside the long walls because they dared not face the superior infantry of the invading Spartans. While this may have been wise as a military strategy, the effect on the psyche of Athenian men was incalculable, especially veterans of earlier and more decisive engagements and those who dwelled in rural demes. Between the massive casualties of plague and decades of war, Athens experienced a demographic crisis with several troubling consequences. Up to 1/3 of boys by the age of 18 no longer had a living father from whom to learn the arts of manhood. And as I've argued elsewhere, male socialization through pederasty was also in decline, as population needs encouraged earlier marriage than in the past. As Meyer, Reinhold, Barry Strauss, and others have observed, the late 5th century saw a generational disconnect between tradition-bound elders. Pranks like the mutilation of the Herms and parodic reenactment of the mysteries seemed calculated to tweak the religious sensibilities of the past, of the pious. Old comedy generically favors the past over what it satirizes as a corrupt and debased present, reaching back to the Hesiotic fantasy of a golden race in contrast to the Iron Age misery of men now. Eupolis Deems brings back statesmen of the past, even as the Frogs resurrects a dead poet. What is clear in Aristophanes' appropriation of this topos is that he presents the contrast between present and past, or young and old, in gendered terms. Prior generations were manly and even if sometimes uncouth and harsh, whereas the young are effeminate and glib, all logoi and no erga. This generational dichotomy is at the heart of Aristophanes' first play, The Banqueters of 427, centered on a father and his two sons, and also his first 4 extant plays, dating from 425 to 422. And here I'm going to share the handout with you. Let's see. Okay, do you all see that? The choruses of Acharnians and Wasps Both self-identify as elderly veterans of the Persian conflicts, as you see on handout
I'm
one.
sorry, I'm sorry, Thomas, to interrupt you. We cannot see the handout, but I guess everyone can download it from the chat. So
let me try doing share screen again.
okay.
Okay, do you see it now?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, good. So the choruses of Acharnians and Wasps both self-identify as elderly veterans of the Persian conflicts, where victory was swift and decisive. This can have been literally true only of men who would now be in their 70s and above, but by focusing on the Panhellenic struggle against the barbarians, Aristophanes draws a sharp contrast to the frustrating and indecisive Archidamian War, in which political maneuvering and strategy among Greek states seemed to count for more than pitched hoplite battles that could test the mettle of man against man in hand-to-hand struggle. What in line 1083, stas aner par andra. The Acharnians in handout 2 are tough old guys, hard as oak, stubborn marathon fighters, men of maple, who wiped off hot manly sweat, and indeed much of it, a man good for the city. The repetition of andrakon and andra in 2b stamped them as the authoritative model of masculine virtue. Similarly, the old jurors of the Wasp chorus call themselves an andrikoteton genos in the first line of example 1. Even the chorus of young knights acknowledge in the Parabasis epireme that their fathers were true men, Andres, while they seek indulgence for their own long hair and jewelry. When the general Nicias is asked about the most manly way to die, he appeals to the previous generation's example of Themistocles, who supposedly committed suicide by drinking bull's blood. In contrast, the same three plays present the younger generation of leaders as scheming, feminine, and sexually passive. The epigrammatic syzygy of the Acharnians' Parabasis presents an outraged picture of helpless old men being harassed by young orators with clever verbal tricks. The paradigmatic case of such a defendant is Thucydides' son of Milesius, and the exemplary young orator is none other than Alcibiades, who is called Euproctos and Lalos. It's handout 3. A man who talks too much and has an anus dilated by habitual passive intercourse. His verbal inventiveness and sexual excess were already themes as early as Aristophanes' Banqueters, fragments 205, 244b. The handsome, ever clean-shaven Alcibiades' status as a sex object for both men and women was notorious. Plutarch relates multiple anecdotes about his scandalous treatment of male lovers when a boy, and once grown, he was so well known as a ladies' man that Eupolis implies he was indistinguishable from them in a crowd. Heracrates, this is handout 4, says, although he isn't a man, he is the man for all our wives. Plutarch tells us that as a boy, Alcibiades was accused by his wrestling partner of biting like a woman. And shortly before his death in Phrygia, he supposedly had a prophetic dream in which the courtesan Timandra dressed him in her own clothes, dandled his head in her lap, and applied makeup to his face, as she in fact did after his death. Alcibiades was hardly the only such effeminate young orator. At the end of Nights, and this is handout 5, a rejuvenated Demos takes charge of affairs again and banishes all beardless men from the public square. This decree pertains not only to obvious effeminates like Cleisthenes and Strato, but to the cleverly chattering Meirakia who hang out at the perfume sellers and invent new words to show off their educated sophistication. Demos will instead send them off to practice the manly art of hunting rather than politics. In two passages, this is 6a and b, WASPs contrast the military service and manliness of the old jurors with the mincing gait and sexual passivity of the young officials who presume to give them directions. In the Parabasis O, this is 6b, the chorus points to their phallic wasp stings and proclaim themselves Andres Alchimotitoi. Even in their old age, they are stronger than the curls, gait, and Europoctia of many young men. The emphasis on the bodily posture and gestures of the young orators as indicative of their sexual passivity and shamelessness adumbrates the rhetorical strategy that Aeschines will later use to great effect in his prosecution of Timarchus. Europoctia, or the state of having an anus dilated due to sexual passivity in one's youth, is not just associated with the very young in Aristophanes, but with the entire ruling class. In Acharnians, Cleon is called lakatapougon. In Knights, the sausage seller's penchant for hiding stolen meat between his thighs as a boy is said to predict his future as a success. Said he was a male prostitute. In an often cited passage at the end of the Agon in Clouds, this is 7 on your handout, all of the city's finest orators, tragedians, and politicians are said to belong to the class of the Europoctoi. Indeed, even the majority of the theatrical audience and the just Logos, who was a traditional pederast, admits that he too belongs to that group. I've argued elsewhere that this negative characterization of pederasty as primarily anal sex, which it wasn't, was a populist impulse in Aristophanes' rhetoric, which played upon lower class suspicions of a practice that was mostly confined to the elites who had the money, time, and leisure to inhabit the wrestling schools and misleading the stereotype that it created habitual sexual passivity assists comedy in its critique of the ruling classes as soft and feminine. The impoverished Acharnians and elderly citizens dependent on jury pay could thus be appealed to on grounds of class prejudice, intersecting with their generational resentment. In contrast, the old common man protagonists of Aristophanic comedy are enthusiastically phallic and active in their tastes. In the phallic procession celebrating his acquisition of a private piece, Dicaeopolis fantasizes about raping his neighbor's slave girl behind the woodpile. And later on, his private market allows him to purchase the Megarians' daughters disguised as piglets for explicitly sexual purposes. Sexual slavery is typically one of the effects of the hero's triumphant feast at the end of the play. Dicaeopolis has one, Philocleon rapes a flute girl taken from her owner, and Trigaius brings back from heaven female slaves named Opera and Theoria, who are to be bathed and prepared for his immediate sexual gratification. The one exception to this strong heterosexual preference is Demos at the end of Knights, handout 8, to whom a muscular boy is presented, available for sexual use if it seems right to you, and note the conditional qualification there. But even in this case, the boy to be so used is a slave, not a freeborn citizen, and thus appropriately assigned a passive role, just like the slave girls in the other plays. Manliness is also defined by a healthy appetite for food. Trygaius exhorts the chorus to eat up just as manfully as when rowing the oars of their ship into battle. For their part, the Persians also regard eating and drinking a lot to be the most manly thing, according to the ambassador in Acarnanians. And who could be more manly than Heracles, stereotypically characterized in comedy as a man of voracious appetite? Contrast this manly old comic hunger for a full stomach with the fussy and etiolated upper-class fish epicures of whom we hear so much in middle comedy. It must be noted that this focus on a generation of manly forebears, in contrast to the weakness and passivity of current leaders, entirely disappears in Aristophanes' later plays, with the partial exception of the intermediate birds, which is not much concerned with gender issues. The remaining 5 plays of Aristophanes present all the male characters as ineffective and pathetic, regardless of generation. Agathon, Euripides' in-law, Blepyrus, and the pro-Bulos in Lysistrata all have to wear women's clothing. The demagogue Agirius is explicitly called a woman in Ecclesia Zeusi. Dionysus is a coward, Plutus blind, Cremulus poor. The young Lothario Epigenes is raped by 3 ugly old women. Even the phallus, the prototypical symbol of male dominance, becomes a visible sign of male weakness, fragility, and desperation in Lysistrata. The women are the ones who show more strength and resolve in 3 of these later plays, with strong heroines like Lysistrata and Praxagora. This motif of female ascendancy should not be interpreted as a proto-feminist polemic, but as a serious reflection on the loss of manhood in the miserable declining years of the Decelean War, when Athens had few generals and leaders who could last, and ultimately suffered defeat at the hands of the more manly Spartans and Thebans. Of course, the marathon veterans of the Acarnanians were all dead by the time of Lysistrata in 411, where the semi-chorus of old men, handout 9, is a weak parody of the determined old men of Acarnanians and wasps. Although they assert that they are an orches aner, literally a man with testicles, and will strip to smell like a man, their claim to have been at Laipsidrium 100 years earlier is manifestly absurd, and they do not even appear to know the correct outcome of that engagement. They are no match for the determination of the old women. But Aristophanes' abandonment of old men as protagonists in his later plays may not only be related to the rapid die-off of Persian War veterans, but also to his unique poetic aims in his earliest plays of the 420s, when Aristophanes himself was indisputably a very young man, progressively and tentatively exposing himself to a much older Athenian public whose approval he was anxious to gain. The self-revelatory Parabasis Anapes of Knights, as I've argued elsewhere, relate the reason for covering his identity with other men as producers. He older comic poets, among whom he classes his rival Critinus. He treats the older generation with a mix of respect, sympathy, and humor, because most of his audience at that stage were older and naturally suspicious of young know-it-alls. Aristophanes is at pains to distance himself from other clever and educated young men of his generation, the ambitious young orators and curly-haired roustabouts who lounge around the perfume cellar, too prone to prettify themselves and their language, habituated to sell themselves through pederastic relations with elite mentors or bribes offered to them as state officials. In contrast to the elite Europroctoi, who dominated Athenian cultural and political life, Aristophanes presented his own persona as distinctly masculine and even heroic, placing him in a position closer to the older generations to whom he wanted his comedy to appeal. In the Parabasis Anapes of Wasp, handout 10a, he specifically expresses his distaste for pederasty and proclaims that unlike other young men, he does not cruise the gymnasia for boys or make boys the subject of his comedy to please others of his age with pederastic inclinations. He repeats the claim lines 762 and 3. Unlike the affected and curly-haired Meirakia banished from the Agora at the end of the Nights, Aristophanes proclaims his own baldness in the Panegos right after this renunciation of pederasty, expressing communal solidarity with all bald men in the city and hope that his victory in peace will be a victory for all of them. Aristophanes cannot have been older than 30 at the time of peace, and premature baldness is well known as an effect of high testosterone levels. This passage asserts that he's a real man, not one of those effeminates overly concerned with cultivating a youthful appearance like Alcibiades or Agathon. Indeed, the Parabases of both Wasps and Peace liken Aristophanes to the super-masculine Heracles, as he confronts and subdues no petty target, but the fearsome Cleon monster, the jag-toothed hound, portrayed in terms rivaling the worst of the beasts Heracles tamed. Fame of his daring and risk-taking heroism on behalf of Athens has even reached the Persian king. Handout 11. Like Heracles and other culture heroes, he is a lexikakos and a purifier of the land. This is at the end of 10a. Aristophanes fashions his own autobiographical fiction to present himself as the bold and manly alternative to the corrupt political and cultural leaders of his day, who are themselves typed as feminine, but who also feminize the Athenian public by encouraging it to sink into passivity and compliant intellectual lethargy. Thank you.